International editor of TalkTV, my colleague Isabel Oakeshott. Good morning, Isabel.
Well, where do we begin? I have spent the morning listening to Matt Hancock in front of the COVID inquiry. It's an appearance that he's actually been preparing for a good year or more now. And having worked with him for a year on his book, I know he was actually quite anxious about this day and will have been spending a lot of time and resources getting his ducks in a row. Thus far, he's given a typically assured and articulate performance, but I'm staggered that the key argument that he's making is actually not one that I heard him make in the entire time we worked together. And it is basically that the fundamental error of the government was in failing to prepare for lockdowns to stop the pandemic taking off in the first place. Now, that is a pretty extraordinary argument to make, because everything we have learned since is that lockdowns basically don't work. You know, the experience of other countries is that going harder, look at what China did, doesn't actually save lives. So it is quite stunning to hear him making this argument his central theme today.
Absolutely. Has he not spotted the ongoing narrative that perhaps, or many of us feel certainly, lockdowns did not work? I keep saying this perfectly logical observation, if you ask me. Once you have a lockdown, like we did the first time, what was it, 2-3 months, and then you unlock, and then a month later you go, oh my God, we're going to lock down again, it automatically reveals that the first lockdown didn't work. I think Hancock cannot bring himself to admit that the truth, in my view, that the lockdowns were probably the most catastrophic political mistake in modern history.
He will never admit that. Never, never, never. What he's doing today is doubling down, the precise reverse of admitting what is certainly to me and to many ordinary people blindingly obvious, that lockdowns were a catastrophe of historic proportions. No, he's arguing that actually the disaster of the pandemic could have been avoided, or at the very least significantly mitigated, if pandemic planning within the Department of Health in the years previous to the pandemic breaking out had focused on how you stop the virus taking off in the first place. And we know now, we've got the benefit of the experience of countries that tried to turn themselves into hermit kingdoms. You know, New Zealand, Australia went very, very hard, not letting their own citizens in and out. We saw what happened in China, appalling human rights abuses in the name of stopping the spread. It didn't work. When you come out of those lockdowns, the thing simply rages forth again.
Baroness Hallett, in charge of the inquiry, she was making comparisons with countries like New Zealand, countries that arguably locked down even harder than we did. In her list of countries that she wanted to compare with Britain, nowhere did the country of Sweden crop up.
Which is very disappointing. And I think if Hancock was asked about Sweden, if he is asked about it, he'll struggle not to refer to it as, quote, bloody Sweden, which is the way he thought of it when he was reflecting on how we in the UK had managed the problem. And indeed, at the time, during the pandemic, he was very frustrated that Sweden had gone a different way. Very bravely, their chief medical officer there, who had much more responsibility for the overall response than his counterpart, Chris Whitty, here in the UK, decided to basically be an outlier and let the Swedish people behave responsibly, but largely make their own judgments about what they needed to protect themselves from the virus. So Sweden didn't have long repeated lockdowns, and we now know, because all the data is in, that they fared overall better.
What's your feeling, Isabel, about the objectivity of this inquiry? Because the narrative does seem to be the potential scandal that will arise in terms of the way the government behaved throughout the crisis was that we did not lock down hard enough, we did not lock down early enough. That seems to be the direction of travel here. No discussion whatsoever of what about if we didn't lock down. I'm very worried about the bias in this inquiry.
So I would say one thing, which is that the actual segment, the module of the inquiry looking at lockdown is not the one we're on at the moment.
Yeah, sure,
so
fair enough.
We got the inquiry a bit of slack for not going into too much depth on the consequence of lockdown. And in fact, this morning, Hancock's been reprimanded by the KC, the lead barrister to the inquiry, for repeatedly bringing up lockdowns, clearly something he feels very strongly he wants to make the defence of. What I am concerned about, well, first of all, I do share your concerns that nobody at the moment is challenging that basic premise, are lockdowns a good thing? But secondly, the politicisation. So this repeated reference to the impact of austerity. I was talking on our colleague Julia Hartley-Brewer's show this morning.
Yeah, you said quite rightly, austerity is a left-wing term.
It is. You know, the rest of us, those of us on the centre-right or the right of centre, however you want to look at it, would frame austerity as something rather different, economic responsibility. So I don't like the way that that term has been wheeled out, and it hasn't been challenged. As far as I've seen, nobody on the Inquisition side of things has pointed out that actually we had an awful lot of capacity because we requisitioned it from the private sector. We had Nightingale hospitals that we never used. More capacity wouldn't necessarily have helped reduce the dreadful impact of the pandemic. And the other thing that they've gone on and on and on about is Brexit and the impact of planning for a so-called no-deal Brexit. Well, I think we all knew, anyone who was remotely close to government basically knew that was never going to happen. Of course, it's the job of governments to plan for all eventualities, but it seems to me a complete nonsense to blame what happened in the pandemic on the chaos in the Brexit years. And if it is to blame, then those on the left who keep referring to it should look to themselves, because they were the ones that kept frustrating the process.
Yeah, well, you know that, Isabel, with the British establishment, in terms of problems, all roads always lead to, I blame Brexit.